Hey everyone, welcome back to Daily Devotions. I pray that you had a great weekend, and as we dive deep into this last week of disciples, we're on that last disciple. And man, he is one that we know well, but what we know of him is not known well. We have our perceptions, we have our kind of push and our judgments and all that kind of stuff on him, and yet I'm not going to set that straight because the scriptures don't set that straight. But here we have the last disciple. His name is Judas of Iscariot. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about Judas and get him into that beginning part. He was a disciple of Jesus. And as we come to these disciples, we get to see a lot of their calls. We get to see called from the sea, we don't get to see the call of Judas, and maybe that's purposeful. But we do get to see that he was involved with one of the 12. While I'm speaking to this go ahead and open up to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, through the Gospel of Mark and Luke and Acts, we get to see 4 accounts that the disciples or even apostles. Now, Acts doesn't list Judas because Judas has already done the act of taking his own life after the betrayal of Jesus. But within this disciples, he's listed in the disciples. He's there with the disciples. I want you to really catch on to that real quickly, because a lot of times we just see him as this villain. But in a real big sense, there is Jesus calling him to be a part of the closeness of what Jesus has going within the kingdom of God. And yes, he does speak towards that it would have been better for him not to be born because of the reality, the reality that he was that man that was going to bring about the kingdom of God through betrayal, through the death of Jesus. And so in Matthew chapter 10, we get to see this Judas of Iscariot. And Iscariot isn't necessarily a well-known place. Kerioth is east of the Dead Sea. So he's really from a different place than all of the disciples, as best as we know through the tradition of the church. And you can look that up. Kerioth is on this Moab side, as I would like to say from the Old Testament, to look across east of the Dead Sea. Everybody else was from the west of the Dead Sea, up in Galilee or around Bethany and those places. So we get to see from east of the Dead Sea. He was somewhere from far off, and he was brought into the place to be within Jesus' disciples. Matthew chapter 10 says this: He called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles, disciples, sent ones, the ones that Jesus was sending, right, with authority. First, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, or always known as Nathanael, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, or James the Less, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 were sent out with the following instructions: Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, preach this message: the kingdom of heaven is near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Don't take along any gold or silver or copper in your belts. Take no bag for the journey, or extra tunic or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. That kind of pushed right at Judas. Don't take any gold or silver, because Judas is known as really their treasurer of the disciples. We'll get into that tomorrow a little bit more, because there is distinct scriptures about Judas, not just about his betrayal, but how he actually walked within the disciples. But I want you to get this. There's a big question in our heads of being able to say, why was Judas ever called to be a disciple of Jesus? Why did Jesus ever call him close? Well, let's leap to the end. What did Judas do in the Garden of Gethsemane? Betray Jesus, but with a kiss. You betray your friend with a kiss. So this just absolutely boggles my mind that God in his foresight, Jesus in his calling of his disciples, called those with flaws, called those with failures, called those imperfect people, and even called his betrayer, knowing that the time would come. That's incredible. And yet, he didn't keep Judas at a distance. Did you hear what he just said? He was an apostle. He was a sent one. He was given authority to do the work of the kingdom of God. And he did the work of the kingdom of God. Sometimes we just push him to the side. And he's just an outcast. He's the betrayer. But yet he was still doing the work of God in and amongst the disciples, as we see in Matthew chapter 10 here. How intense he was involved, we don't know. But he was listed. He was present. And I pray that ministers to us, or that ministers to the people around you. Jesus calls not the ones who have it all together. Jesus calls not the ones without flaws or failures or sin. Sinners though we are, he calls us into his kingdom, calls us into his work. Not so that we get to see, we're seen better, not so that we have good works. No, we're called into being a disciple of Jesus so that we can just be close to Jesus, no matter our flaws and our failures and the darkness that even overtakes Judas. He calls us close. See what the Father can do. Now, as we get to the end of Judas's life, we all say, well, it must not have worked. That's our judgment. We don't know. We have no idea what it looks like for Judas in his eternity. That's God's. And we have to leave that in God's hands. But what we do know is that he was a called disciple of Jesus, close to Jesus, doing the work of the kingdom of God, heard the gospel, saw the gospel. And so I guess I always reflect back on Romans chapter 1 when thinking of people and their flaws and their failures and their eternity. When Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of salvation. Our flaws, our failures, our decisions in life, boy, if they have determination on our eternity, then we're in the wrong camp. We're in the wrong mindset. Because we've been saved by grace through faith, not by works, so that no one can boast. But it also goes for the opposite. What does that look like for salvation and amongst just the gospel alone, rather than our works or our failures or flaws? I want you to see Judas maybe not just in a different light. It's not going to be easy to do. But I just want you to see him as a disciple, as an apostle here, sent by Jesus' authority to do the work of God, even with faults and failures, even with flaws, even with what we know from at the end of life. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to look in the mirror a little bit easier. Or maybe you can look to that other person a little earlier, a little easier. Because God calls people, faults, flaws, failures, darkness, whatever, sin. And he pursues them. So maybe today isn't necessarily about looking at Judas, but it's looking at the people around you and saying, they're a precious child of God. I'm not sure what their eternity or what their end of life. All I know is the present, that they're in front of me, and I have the opportunity to be able to live, proclaim, talk, have a conversation, praying that it leads towards an eternal conversation. The gospel that is the power of salvation. Brothers and sisters, may we have eyes of Jesus this day, looking around us, not looking to faults and failures and flaws, but rather looking with eyes of love and of kindness, and I pray of conversation about the gospel of Jesus to anyone you encounter. Be present today. Don't look too far into the future, maybe not look into their past, but be present today, just as Jesus is present with you today. His mercies and his grace are ever new. This day, today, he loves you. May your love be evident to others, from Jesus, for Jesus. Have a present, gospel-centered day, and a blessed one.